Hello there, it is Andy with the Fence Post Vinyl Blog. David Bowie's album, Space Oddity, is, well, it's an iconic work of art. And it's had a lasting impact on music and popular culture alike. Originally released in 1969, it was Bowie's second album, and it marked a notable turning point for him in his career. Today, I am looking back at that album and recounting 7 interesting things about David Bowie's Space Oddity. Number 1, Space Oddity wasn't the original title. And, it makes sense to start at the beginning, right? And that means an album titled David Bowie. No, I'm not talking about David Bowie's debut LP, which did have that title. I'm talking about this record. It was actually also called David Bowie, at least in Europe. Released in 1969, the title of the earliest pressings in Europe matched that of his debut album. They were self-titled and labeled David Bowie. These were on Philips in the UK and throughout Europe. In the United States market, however, it was Mercury Records. And they listed the album as Man of Words / Man of Music. It wasn't until 3 years later, 1972, that the album would re-emerge on RCA Victor. At this time, it was rebranded as Space Oddity. That decision was made to really leverage the growing popularity of the lead single from the LP. Number 2, the artwork changed along with the name. So additionally, with the new name, the album received new artwork. My copy here is an original rebranded 1972 pressing of Space Oddity. This depicts Ziggy Stardust, which was Bowie's stage persona between 1972 and 1973. 1972 being the year he released The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and The Spiders from Mars. As far as I can tell, the original artwork didn't resurface on a new variant until about 1999. And it found its way onto a variety of remasters on CD. Though it appears all these still held the name Space Oddity. Now, it was in 2000 that a 180-gram LP was released, featuring the original artwork and the original title, David Bowie. A 40th anniversary pressing of the vinyl surfaced in about 2009 as well, with the original art. And then since about 2012 or 2013, it seems all subsequent reissues have had artwork similar to the original. Those kind of flirt back and forth with the names David Bowie and Space Oddity. No consistency, really. Number 3, Ziggy Stardust, an ode to 2 artists. Now, this is a little bit different. Now, of course, the depiction of Ziggy Stardust, as I mentioned previously, is a nod to Bowie's stage persona circa 72 and 73, and it's a reference to his 1972 album, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and The Spiders of Mars. In fact, I have my copy right here. Now, persona aside, the name Ziggy Stardust actually stems from 2 different artists. The first, to no surprise, is a nod to David Bowie's friend Iggy Pop. The wordplay can actually be seen on my bootleg copy of Iggy and Ziggy, which I'm going to put my finger on Iggy Pop's penis, because I can't necessarily show it here. Although I guess that's lewd in and of itself, right? The interesting wordplay can actually be seen on this, Iggy and Ziggy, live in Seattle 4/9/77, as you can see right there. The second artist is a little bit more elusive, and I stumbled upon the story recently via the Ongoing History of New Music podcast on an episode titled Outsider Music. Stardust is actually a nod to a recording artist named Norm Odom, who was also known as the, quote, legendary Stardust Cowboy. Hailing from Lubbock, Texas, Odom released a 7-inch called Paralyzed on Mercury. As part of the welcome package for signing to Mercury, the label gave Bowie a number of releases, kind of as a little welcoming gift. Paralyzed was included within, Bowie became fascinated with the legendary Stardust Cowboy. The rest, as they say, in such a cliche term, is history. Number 4. What inspired Space Oddity? The album's title track, Space Oddity, tells the story of Major Tom, an astronaut who becomes lost in space. The song was, indeed, inspired by Stanley Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it was released just prior to the Apollo 11 mission to the moon. Yes, so the song was inspired and influenced by Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was released in 1968. It also stemmed from Bowie's own experiences with drug use and personal transformation. He wrote the song while under the influence and while watching the film. Bowie once said that the, quote, sense of isolation, end quote, that he saw in the film was what sparked the idea for the song. The song's iconic melody and lyrics have made it one of Bowie's most enduring and beloved works. And as such, it tends to be the one that dominates this list. Number 5, the origination of Major Tom. So the origination of Major Tom may have stemmed from 2001: A Space Odyssey, but within the mind of David Bowie, it went much further than the film. His debut spotlight may have been the song Space Oddity, but he is a recurring presence for Bowie pretty much throughout his career. Many consider Major Tom to have been a persona of Bowie himself, and references to the alter ego can be found throughout Bowie's career. I mean, he pops up in Ashes to Ashes off Scary Monsters from 1980, where Bowie calls him flat out a junkie, which is a reference to Bowie's own struggles with substance abuse. There's Hello Space Boy from Bowie's 1995 album Outside, where it was the third single from the LP. Now, the studio version doesn't mention him, but a 1996 remix of that song with the Pet Shop Boys does. Not a direct reference, but in the music video for Slow Burn, off Bowie's 2002 LP Heathen, well, that features an astronaut. May or may not be Major Tom. Let me know what you think down in the comments. And, of course, he was mentioned in Black Star, the title track off of Bowie's final studio release in 2016, which came out 2 days prior to his death. In the music video, a dead astronaut, skeletal with jewel-laden skull, makes an appearance. While speculation, the director of the video, Johan Renck, stated, quote, "To me, it's 100% Major Tom." Given the context surrounding Black Star and Bowie's send-off to his fans, I would completely agree. Number 6, BBC played Space Oddity during the Apollo 11 mission broadcast. But then, Apollo 11 was, of course, the landing in which Neil Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon. The mission took place July 16 through 24, 1969, and the timing was impeccable. Space Oddity was just released the week prior, July 11, 1969. This timing was not coincidental whatsoever. It was quite purposeful. The label rushed the release to capitalize on the moon landing, and BBC ultimately used the song as background music during the coverage of the event. We gotta quote David Bowie himself here, because this is just brilliant. And I quote, "It was picked up by British television and used as the background music for the landing itself in Britain. Though I'm sure they really weren't listening to the lyric at all. It wasn't a pleasant thing to juxtapose against a moon landing. Of course, I was overjoyed they did." End quote. BBC ultimately wised up to the lyrics, and they briefly banned the song. I do not know exactly when they stopped that ban, but it was at the very least until the astronauts go home safely. Apollo 11 wasn't the only time Space Odyssey was played in conjunction with a space mission. In 2013, Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield performed a rendition of the song while floating in zero gravity through a space module over 200 miles above Earth. Hadfield took the liberty and omitted a lyric or two, and Bowie himself actually acknowledged the performance on Twitter. I'll have a link down to a CNN article on that coverage in the description of this video. Number 7. Through an obscure affiliation, it helped influence the 2003 film School of Rock. This is the story of how Space Oddity, through affiliation, would influence the 2003 film featuring Jack Black. Of course, as I noted, I am talking about School of Rock. For this, we must move past 1969, the original release of the album, past 1972, the reissue. We step away from the UK and Europe. We step away from the United States, and we land ourselves in British Columbia, Canada, 1976, 1977, somewhere in there. But it wasn't until many, many years later that Bowie would mutter a few words about this little-known cover song. And that was, of course, Space Oddity. Once again, he called it astounding and, quote, a piece of art that I couldn't have conceived of, end quote. This one also comes from Outsider Music and the ongoing history of New Music Podcast. The artist, well, artist isn't really the right word. The conductor was Hans Fenger. I love that name, by the way. Fenger was the mastermind behind the Langley School's Music Project, a collection of popular songs of the day that he loved. Rather than perform them himself, he directed the performance through children's choruses in British Columbia, Canada in 1976 and 1977. The students came from 4 different elementary schools around the Langley area, which is just outside of Vancouver, BC. What set these apart, though, was how they were recorded and the corresponding effect it created for all of the songs. They were recorded in one of the school's gyms. 2 LPs were recorded, originally pressed to just 300 copies on vinyl and distributed amongst friends and family and the like. The records would essentially remain forgotten until 2000 and 2001, to be honest. So it is a little bit odd that Space Oddity was inspired by 2001, A Space Odyssey, and these recordings technically resurfaced of the song in 2001. But I am not a conspiracy theorist. Instead, I'll chalk it up to actual facts. So why don't we look at those? The story goes like this. Brian Linz, a record collector out of Victoria, BC, which is on the other side of Vancouver, stumbled upon the LP in a thrift store in about 2000. He sent it to his friend Erwin Chuzid, a journalist, music historian, and devout fan of Outsider Music. Erwin set out to have them reissued, and bar none is the label that stepped up. After nearly a dozen rejections, 10 in fact. The artist is credited as the Langley School's Music Project, and the album is dubbed Innocence and Despair. Fenger would say this about the experience and the recordings. Quote, "This was not the way music was traditionally taught. But then I never liked conventional children's music, which is condescending and ignores the reality of children's lives, which can be dark and scary. These children hated cute. They cherished songs that evoked loneliness and sadness." End quote. Upon reissue in 2001, this project generated quite a bit of buzz, and that's what led to Bowie's quote that I quoted earlier. But Bowie wasn't the only one. Fred Schneider of the B-52s and Richard Carpenter of the Carpenters had good things to say about the album. I mean, it included popular songs from that era. In fact, the 2003 film School of Rock is said to have been inspired by Langley School's Music Project. So, in essence, Space Oddity helped through affiliation, inspire and influence School of Rock. There we go. Now on for a quick conclusion. So Bowie's had a lasting impact on music and popular culture. This album's songs and themes and imagery and even videos have inspired countless artists and musicians and even filmmakers over the years. Featuring a mix of acoustic and electric songs, its influences range from folk to psychedelic to even hard rock. And honestly, even prog is heard on the 9-minute A-side closer, Signet Committee. The album's eclectic sound reflects Bowie's desire to experiment and push boundaries. The boundaries of his art, the boundaries of himself as a person, etc. Now, looking at it today, looking back today, it's astonishing to think that this album is comfortably in its mid-50s, at a whopping 54 years old. It seems groundbreaking today, as it must have back then. It's kind of hard to imagine him having the impact that he ultimately went on to have without it. Do you recall your introduction to David Bowie? Was it Space Oddity? Was it something else? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to know. I've got a whole bunch more from my collection, so don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, because I am nowhere near done covering David Bowie. I'd love to know what you think, and I'll see you next time.